So let me introduce the speakers again in the order in which they will speak. To my immediate left is Reverend Beth Miller of the Unitarian Universalist Association. She serves the Universalist Association of Congregations as Director of Ministry and Professional Leadership. She took her bachelor's degree in Religion and Philosophy from Hood College in Frederick, Maryland, and her Master of Divinity from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. She has served Unitarian Universalist congregations in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Mentor, Ohio, and Carmel, California. To her immediate left, we welcome Professor Silver, Professor Allan Silver from Columbia University, who will offer perspectives on ROTC-Ivy League history. Professor Silver is Professor of Sociology at Columbia. He has taught social theory and politics in the Columbia core curriculum. His research interests cut across biblical kingship and U.S. war and peace relations. And to his left, we welcome Margaret O'Connor, a junior from Tufts University, who is co-chair of the organization at Tufts entitled Allies, the alliance linking leaders in education and the services. So we welcome her from Tufts, and I'd ask each speaker to either use the podium or to speak sitting down, whatever is most comfortable.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's so far been a really interesting morning, and like the rest of you, I've enjoyed the speakers who've come before me and look forward to the rest of the day. I want to give you a little bit of, start a little bit with some history, and then talk a little bit about why people of progressive religious faith are particularly well suited for military chaplaincy. I think to start out, I want to say that there has been, at least among Unitarian Universalists, and I think among most liberal or progressive religious bodies, organizations, a bit of an ambivalent relationship between their faith and military service, kind of from the beginning. And it's been kind of back and forth, sometimes more positive, sometimes more negative, ever since. I know for Unitarian Universalists, our history goes all the way back to the founding fathers. We were among the signers of the Constitution and very active in the Revolutionary War. 30 of the chaplains during the Civil War served on the Union side of the Civil War. We had Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic as the anthem for the Union side in the Civil War. And then later she had sort of a turn of heart in the period of the Franco-Prussian War and became a pacifist and wrote passionately the Mother's Day Declaration, proclaiming a need for us to eschew war. World War II was highly controversial among at least the Unitarians and the Universalists. You don't know much about our history, but they were two bodies prior to 1961 when there was a merger, and I don't have time to go into all of our religious history, but I think we're not atypical of progressive and liberal religions in the United States. William Howard Taft, who was the president, became the moderator of the American Unitarian Association after he was president. And at one of our general assemblies during that period, the assembly voted to be in favor of World War I. But many of our prominent ministers opposed it. And at one point, there was a big kind of internal battle about this. And the denomination at the time withdrew support for congregations that proclaimed opposition to World War I. World War II was generally supported among our denomination and among most progressive and liberal religions. I was so touched by your story of being a disciple of Christ and growing up in the Father. Where is she? she left. Oh, anyway, her story is not uncommon among religious bodies in the United States during that period. The Vietnam War changed everything. The 60s changed much. In our denomination, congregations were split over that. The World War II generation, who had served so faithfully and so proudly, felt their dignity was undermined by the tone and the tenor of the anti-war movement at the time. And I think one of the things that I hope we've learned between that period and this war was how to treat those who serve with greater dignity, and to be able to separate our feelings about a war with our feelings about those who serve in war. The president of our denomination, Bill Sinkford, was invited to do one of the prayer breakfasts during the early days of the Iraq War, and did, and addressed the military there and affirmed their service, and also said that I also march in anti-war demonstrations. And he was able to hold that tension and express the both and of that. In recent history, we've had 3 Unitarian Universalist Secretaries of Defense. Elliot Richardson, William Perry, and William Cohen were all Unitarian Universalists and were able to serve in that capacity and be persons of faith in that denomination. So I think the ambivalence and the both and the yes-no of it all is sort of endemic to us, and probably is to many of the faith communities who see themselves as on the liberal or progressive side of the religious spectrum. I want to say a few things about how Unitarian Universalists in particular, and to a degree, along a continuum, faiths that are liberal and progressive and or progressive are particularly well suited to military chaplaincy. For us, we're a non-creedal faith. We've never had a creed that you had to affirm in order to be a Unitarian Universalist, and therefore there have been influences. Although it began as a Judeo-Christian faith, it was part of the Reformation family of faiths, the far left wing of the Protestant Reformation is how we see ourselves, and yet it has had influences. The 3 kind of most significant ones in the United States are the Transcendentalist movement, which began as a movement within the clergy and ended up in Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau and those guys. And as a result of that movement in American history and in our history, Eastern thought came into, Eastern religions came into our consciousness. The humanist movement of the 1940s, 50s was largely started among Unitarian clergy and made its way back to the pulpits and pews, and brought in a sensitivity to humanist thought and to secular wisdom aside from biblical faith or Judeo-Christian faith. And in addition, the women's movement that started to look at and reclaim pre-Christian feminist religious traditions brought a consciousness toward paganism, pre-Christian paganism, and a sort of a interest in neo-paganism into our consciousness as well. Our sources of inspiration include prominently Judeo-Christian traditions, but also the world's religions and humanist thought. So there is this by intention and design, multilingual, theologically multilingual perspective among our clergy that makes them naturally at ease with the diversity that is found in the military today. So our chaplains serve comfortably and well. In addition, our principles call for a couple of things. The worth and dignity of every human being is one, and the other is the individual search for truth and meaning. Our clergy are not proclaiming a word to a particular word to those to whom they minister, but drawing out of them what is your sense of the holy, what is your sense of your relationship to the ultimate, and how can we help you with that? How can we nurture your faith? And so that's makes them particularly well suited for that. I want to lift up some of the tensions in the couple of minutes I have left. There is, of course, a tension between peace activism on the one hand and military service on the other, and support for soldiers, and that gets played out in our congregations sometimes. That those who are serving the military feel a little unwelcome, feel their dignity is undermined by still a sense of strong activism for peace among the folks who were doing that in the 60s as well. I mean, that population has become my age, and some have become more sensitive and others have not. And so there's that tension that our military chaplains live with. There is a tension between don't ask, don't tell. Our perspective is one of that values integrity, that values being able to bring together what we profess and how we live our lives into closer and closer relationship. And don't ask, don't tell undermines that. I don't know, but I would venture to guess that our military chaplains won't turn in those who confess to being gay. I would venture to guess that they won't do that. They just won't do that. But that tension is there, and I know that our military chaplains and members of our congregations are working actively to overthrow this, to turn this around, and they're on the gentleman's side of that, Mr. Steinman's, Rear Admiral Steinman's side of that, and would be counted among those working actively for that. And then there is a tension between progressive church culture and military culture, I think, to some degree, and people find a pull there between those two. So our chaplains serve with those kinds of tensions and ambivalences. That said, I'll say that we have worked very hard to bring military chaplaincy back into the fold. We went through a period of time following World War II and up until the present day where we had very, very few chaplains serving in the military. And when I started in my position, I noticed that, and I won't take credit, because what happened was a woman working on a D-Min on military chaplaincy came to me and said, we need to be there. We need to be more present. Do you know that our policies and programs of credentialing ministers make it very, very difficult to become a military chaplain while you're becoming a minister? And I said, no, I didn't know that. Tell me more. And we've been working very hard to facilitate, to make our process and the military's process more compatible with each other so that people can become chaplains and ministers with us at the same time, and several of our chaplain candidates are among you here at Harvard Divinity School. I'm pleased and proud of that. I want to close with a brief little reading from one of the things that we did in World War II. We put, as many denominations did, put together a little pocket reader for military personnel to carry with them in their in the field. And Frederick May Elliott, who was the president of the Unitarian Association at that time, said, "This book has been planned and prepared to offer to young men in national service a means of fortifying their faith in the basic religious principles of democracy." He then, as we always have, spoken of those principles, the principles of democracy and the principles of faith, as being very closely aligned. Underneath all the differences of belief and practice, which often seem to divide the various churches into hostile camps, there are fundamental unities of spirit and purpose which are far more important, and it is to strengthen your hold upon these unities that every selection in this volume has been chosen. And I would like to just say that I think that's the chaplain's call. I really do think that's the chaplain's call, to hold upon these unities rather than to be divisive, and to help that sense of unity to prevail. And I'll close by saying a few words from William Ellery Channing, who wrote, whatever you may suffer, speak the truth. Be worthy of the entire confidence of your associates. Consider what is right as what must be done. It is not necessary that you should keep your property or even your life, but it is necessary that you should hold fast to your integrity. And this is something that we would hope those who serve our military will be able to do, to hold fast to their integrity. Thank you.
I thank you very much. I would invite Professor Allan Silver.
Is this on? Yes. Why is ROTC largely absent from the selective private universities in general and from the Ivy League in particular? A prevailing account might be called the bad university, good military narrative. 4 decades ago, students and younger faculty rebelled against high culture, scholarly tradition, and their legitimate civic obligations. Today, the inheritance of that time, though much altered in substance and style, encounters an unconfident and spineless academic liberalism. But in contrast, the military is an exemplar of civic virtue, expressing the tradition of the citizen soldier and actualizing ideals of obligation and sacrifice in the nation's service. Today, however, opposition to restoring ROTC turns massively on the prohibition of service by open homosexuals. At Columbia, objections to Don't Ask, Don't Tell have dominated the discussion on ROTC for over 5 years. And reform of this law, or its repeal, better, is a prerequisite for ROTC's return. If Don't Ask, Don't Tell is repealed or sufficiently reformed, principled opposition to ROTC by a passionate minority will visibly emerge. However, if our experience at Columbia is a guide, and many of us think there that the balance of student opinion is likely to favor, or at the least permit, ROTC's return. Now, contrary to a prevailing belief, the Ivy League never actually banned, the word is often used, banned ROTC as such. A legislation in force then and now requires that commanding officers have professorial appointments, and that the universities accept a curriculum prescribed by the Department of Defense. At Yale, Harvard, and Columbia, and elsewhere, this was the formal basis for the termination of ROTC in the years 69 and 70. At Columbia, a committee chaired in 1969 by a conservative political theorist, Professor Harvey C. Mansfield, who was the father, indeed, of the distinguished conservative political theorist at Harvard, who bears his name. That committee unanimously recommended the termination of ROTC if these terms could not be renegotiated. The Department of Defense withdrew ROTC programs at that time, and to my best understanding, had no choice given the terms of the relevant or the governing legislation. Of course, a passionate opposition to the Vietnam War drove the divorce between the Ivy League and ROTC. I well remember being alerted to intervene in fistfights between opponents of ROTC and students participating in that program. However, a concern with faculty autonomy was not solely a means to oppose the Vietnam War. As the Mansfield report put it in 1969, we regret that we did not take such action before the present mood on campus, but we cannot refuse to take steps to correct an academically irregular situation merely because of that need arose, that mood arose. At Yale, by the way, there had been quite a bit of discussion before the Vietnam period on the anomalous situation of ROTC in terms of academic culture. Today, I cannot imagine ROTC's return if this matter, that is the matter of faculty control over appointments and curriculum, is not resolved. Now, to be sure, exactly like objections to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it may offer a cover for it may offer cover, or camouflage, if you will, for unconditional opposition to ROTC. However, faculty authority over appointments and curriculum does touch the essence. And this problem will require thoughtful negotiation, drawing on the goodwill of both parties. The Mansfield Committee considered their recommendations to cancel, I'm quoting, exceptions from normal academic procedures which were granted during or immediately after World War II. This suggests a broad context in which to consider the vicissitudes of ROTC, World War II, the Cold War, and the inflamed moment of the war in Vietnam. During World War II, Ivy League institutions, like others, housed very large-scale training programs which produced young officers. From 1942 to 46, Columbia housed a midshipman training school that graduated 23,000 naval officers. In the next quarter century, its naval ROTC program produced 1,000 commissioned officers until the disruption of the late 1960s, and a similar pattern, of course, prevailed throughout the Ivy League and other private institutions. The normative setting, as it were, the point of departure, what we have in memory, and many of us, about ROTC programs, formed in the first 20 years of the Cold War. That pattern or that model, if and when, as I certainly warmly hope ROTC returns, that model will be significantly altered. In the Cold War, for the first time in its history, the nation was continuously semi-mobilized for war, the possibility of war, over an extended period. A conscription, which was intensive during the Korean crisis, was retained at levels by design, permitted many of the unwilling to escape service. Some, perhaps many Ivy League students, preferred ROTC to conscripted service in the ranks. And that's why they were in ROTC. But a positive, or at least an acquiescent attitude to service in the armed forces was pervasive. A term of military service was normal for many Americans, for many American men, thank you, coming of age after the intensive mobilization of the Second World War. And as Kathy has pointed out, a divide gradually emerged between those whose citizenship included a term of military service and younger cohorts who defined the obligations of citizenship entirely in terms of civilian activities. That divide, of course, sharpened after the end of conscription in '73. In 1956, Princeton graduated 400 students who later served in uniform. For the class of 2004, that number was 9. The citizen soldier remains an ideal, but its celebration is broadly vicarious. At any one point in time, about 1% of the population is in military service. The nation's military endeavors after September 2001 do not require extensive mobilization in terms of taxation, manpower, or intensive popular enthusiasm. On the contrary, a relaxed mobilization is key to our long-term military endeavors. The current model of military mobilization is compatible with the routine functioning of civil society. Ivy League students, to some measure, reflect this broad picture. They are culturally and personally distant from the military, more by incomprehension and distaste, I think, than hostility. Their sense of citizenship obligations turns solely or largely on voluntary activity in civil society, and again, as Kathy has pointed out, prevailingly, they lack personal connections with people in military service. Now, in public discourse, it often appears that elitist Ivy League colleges, universities, are wholly responsible for ROTC's absence from its self-indulgent campuses. However, the military has made its own contribution to the present unsatisfactory state of affairs. The bad university, a good military narrative, vividly remembers the convulsion of the 1960s, but takes a little or no notice of the military's long-term response. For example, and I'm quoting from the Army Cadet Command's official history, the abolition of ROTC units at elite institutions along the eastern seaboard was more than offset, quantitatively at least, by the creation of additional detachments in the south and west. Some feared that the average quality of ROT students would drop and that the social balance of the Army Officer Corps would be upset. Other officials and officers were glad to see the Army sever relations with schools, which in their opinion had never been avid supporters of the military. And this division, I've ended my quotation from this text, persists more or less, I gather, in all the services. The divorce between the Ivy League and ROTC programs is linked as part of a conspicuous withdrawal of ROTC from the Northeast region as a whole and its diverse urban areas. We all remember that this began in the period of the Vietnam War, but it is less known that it continued during the drawdown of the 1990s. Budgetary constraints encourage the shift because more young officers can be procured for less expenditure at large public institutions, many of which, of course, are legally obligated to accept ROTC programs. The military also prefers to locate programs in regions with pervasive pro-military cultures. To take but one illustration, many more are available. Virginia, with a population of about 7,500,000, has 12 Army ROTC programs, while New York City, with a population of 8,500,000, has 2. The military's budgetary problems are a counterpart of academia's concern with don't ask, don't tell, and faculty autonomy. All of these are genuine concerns in themselves. They may also offer a plausible cover for an underlying attitude. In the military's case, a preference for regions with pro-military cultures, so-called pro-military cultures, and aversion to campuses where anti-military sentiment took highly charged forms 4 decades ago, and to a certain extent, as we've heard, continue today in attenuated, if palpable, forms. The Department of Defense should go out of its way to create ROTC programs in places where the nation's future military endeavors may well provoke active criticism and opposition. It is the historical norm that the nation's wars are politically contested. World War II and much of the Cold War were exceptionally consensual, and Vietnam was exceptionally rancorous. To apply the consensual model of World War II and the Cold War to the future is to constrict a democratic debate on military policies. The Ivy League may serve as a conspicuous model, combining the military service of some students with a vigorous political culture of debate on military policy as determined by civilian government. It is a corrosive civic scandal that those with high prospects in the society and economy are egregiously underrepresented in military service. This inflicts symbolic and substantive damage on the Republic. It weakens ties that ought to bind all citizens and deprives our military of broadly educated officers needed now more than ever. Civilian and military leadership should bind up the nation's cultural wounds and reach out to the splendid young men and women in the Ivy League and other selective private institutions who will wish to serve the nation under arms.
Thank you, Professor Silver. I now invite Ms. Kathy O'Connor to address us either here or at the podium, whichever.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
My name is Margaret O'Connor, and I'm a junior at Tufts University. And sorry, is that better? Okay. And co-chair of an organization there called Allies, the Alliance Linking Leaders in Education and the Services. And I would just like to begin this presentation by thanking Lucas and Roz for inviting me to sit on such a distinguished panel. I'm going to try and be brief because I'm sure that we're all eager to get to the question and answer sessions. But what I would like to do at this time is to share with you what I think is a really promising initiative to bridge some of the gaps that we've been discussing so far this morning between our future leaders on the civilian side of national security and on the military side. And that is what we do at Allies. Okay, so I'd like to begin with just drawing your attention to two quotes from Secretary Gates and the following from former Secretary Rice about the need for civilian and military participation in national security. So the challenges that we've been discussing this morning come from both the government side of things and within our society. At the government level, they include a disparity in capacity between the Department of Defense and other government agencies. The Department of Defense budget dwarfs by far any other government agency. Cultural and institutional differences, stovepiped career paths with little interagency focus, and a lack of civil military education at the undergraduate level to help bring these two different types of cultures together. And within society, we see a limited civilian exposure to the military, persistent suspicion and lack of trust on both sides. And after 9/11, while many of our country's young men and women were showing up to recruitment centers in droves, our commander-in-chief at that time encouraged the nation's citizenry to go shopping and failed to capitalize on that sort of spirit of service and the fact that we are all in it together, as the title of this panel rightfully asserts. And a lack of proportional representation of our nation as a whole within the armed forces. Currently, the armed forces are vastly more Southern, insular, and conservative than the population as a whole. And that only serves to exacerbate the institutional gaps that we see between civilians and the military. So right about the same time as those two quotes that I showed you before, those statements were being made at the highest level. At Tufts, there were 3 students who, through their experience at another program at Tufts called EPIC, where military students were invited to participate and attend a symposium there, through their interactions with those students, realized that there was a huge gap in their understanding of U.S. foreign policy because they did not understand where the military was coming from or how it operated, or how their future careers would interact with it. And so they decided to capitalize on the relationship that already existed between Tufts and the academies, and create this institution called Allies. So at Allies, we attempt to bridge this military gap through joint education and relationship building and training. And right now, our organization consists of a Tufts chapter, a chapter at the Air Force Academy, a really vibrant chapter at the Naval Academy, and a chapter in its infancy at West Point. So it's not just a Tufts initiative. It has independent chapters at 4 of these institutions. On the education side of things, our flagship program is the Joint Research Project, which is an annual program that takes students from Tufts and from the military academies away together for a month in the summer to conduct research together on a topic of shared interest. So the past 2 years, they've traveled to Jordan, and I participated in last year's Joint Research Project. And what we were studying there was the effect of the Iraq War on one of the United States' major allies, Jordan. And so we looked at several different subtopics, from refugee issues to democratic reform there to regional diplomacy between Jordan and its Middle Eastern neighbors. We also have, in the Tufts Peace and Justice Studies program, a movement to create a shared curriculum with the academies. That, as you can probably imagine, is a very slow-moving process because of institutional red tape. But Professor Paul Joseph of the Peace and Justice Studies program is beginning to integrate video conferencing with students at the Naval Academy into his course on the sociology of war and peace. In other just general programming, Tufts students attend Service Academy Foreign Affairs conferences. They come to our conferences. And that's a really good opportunity to have a dialogue about foreign policy and just about the civil-military relationship in general. As an individual chapter, Allies at Tufts holds other events to educate not only our members but the broader Tufts community about these issues, and this is just an example of a symposium that we held last year in conjunction with the Tufts Democrats. On the training side of things, some of the programs that we've had in the past have included Tufts students participating in the U.S. Marine Corps Force Civil Affairs Group exercise in Quantico, Virginia. 3 Tufts students attended FAHUM. I don't speak Spanish, so excuse me. Fuerzas Aliadas Humanitarias, which is a joint disaster response exercise for 26 Latin American and Caribbean countries. That took place in 2007, and 3 Tufts students attended that as observers. And earlier this year, Tufts students participated with Air Force ROTC cadets from Detachment 365, which includes ROTC students from Tufts, MIT, and Harvard in a crisis simulation as well. And so there was role playing for the civilian and military aspects of what to do in a crisis. And then in terms of relationships, during any of our joint events, we try and make plenty of time for dialogue about issues such as many of the things we've been discussing today, the role of class and class gaps in the military, gender, sexuality, and political differences as well. So for Allies, our big goal is to help move our country and especially future leadership from a situation where you see this to one where you see this, civilian and military leaders standing shoulder to shoulder to share the burden of national security and the national interest. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.